Hey, Bruce Fenton, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome.
No, it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for having me on as a guest.
Yeah, it's absolutely my honor. And, one of the ways you can start a podcast is to immediately go into someone's background and establish their
Mm,
credibility. I'm going to say, let's not do that. Let's get there along the way. We'll hit that. But for here, I want to
mhm,
just put something to you. Those of us who think outside the box, who fall into strange algorithms, who pay attention to the UAP and alien question, basically we're presented with this hodgepodge scenario of, is it aliens? Is it mantids
mhm,
living in the oceans? Are they interdimensional beings? Is it angels and demons? Is it just a breakaway secret human tech? Is it a
mhm,
breakaway civilization? What's the role of consciousness? Are we living on a soul farm? This is a up and down, very wide range of possibilities that
mhm,
people
mhm.
ponder. So I'm here to put it to you squarely. Are there aliens? Are they here? Are they demons?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good place to start. I mean, as most people will know by now, it's certainly a hot topic, and not just UFOs, but the demons and angels aspect to this whole kind of phenomena. So I think it has to be tackled squarely. That I view this in a somewhat nuanced way. I would say that if you look at the kind of theistic approach to the topic. Particularly, we live in a primarily Christian milieu. I mean, obviously not just, but primarily. So if we take it from that, I'd actually say it's easier to make a case for any present non-human intelligence, or aliens, to be angels than it is for demons. And then the
Hmm.
reason why I say that is that if we to take the kind of the theistic understanding from academics that look at Christian theology, the understanding of demons is that they are, a form of unclean spirits, probably the wandering spirits of the drowned Nephilim, hybrids of the sons of the Elohim, and which makes them quite a narrow kind of concept, right? That you have this particular class of entities who would be we would expect to be somewhat limited in number and also limited in range of behaviors and what they're supposed to be like, right?
Mm.
So it's actually quite narrow. Whereas the term angel comes from the underlying word, which is just messenger, right? So the underlying meaning of angel is messenger.
Hmm.
We know from the kind of theistic approach that these messengers can be human, or certainly appear to be human. They can be higher beings, divine intelligences that are used for tasks by the kind of the Godhead, or they can be something in between. There's not really a narrowing of what these messengers, these angels can be. So, in other words,
Mm.
God can potentially use absolutely anything, any sentience within the creation, right, to
Hmm.
carry messengers and do tasks, right?
Mm.
There's no real limit to that. So if you think about it, yeah, that term demon is a much, much narrower. So now consider the reports from people who say that they've had contacts with non-human intelligences, and there's a wide range of types, descriptions, experiences. But I would say that the vast majority involve some kind of message. So that's kind of funny. Rather than saying the majority of people being, molested and bothered and having their lives ruined, I'm not saying
Mm.
that doesn't happen, but the vast
Mm.
majority seem to report some kind of conversation, an exchange and information they didn't have, whether it's true or not, but information is given to them and they
Mm.
go away and kind of, internalize or share that information. So from the outset, I think that perhaps, yeah, it's going the wrong way to kind of say aliens are demons. It would be much
Mm.
easier to say angels are aliens. Sorry, no, sorry, aliens are angels. So
Mm.
the reverse. I'm not saying that is a coverall for every experience, but I think you can probably appreciate where I'm going with that. I just think that perhaps that you know people should be mindful and true to the underlying premises in the theological arguments that they're not quite so easy to just throw into this singular basket of anything out there that doesn't quite fit the known must be a demon. I don't see that as being supportable by biblical texts.
Mm. And that, there's the fear instinct, right? When you're thinking about this stuff to assume. And so it's very powerful, obviously. But
Hmm.
my instinct actually is to say as well, no, that don't be frail and small and think small and it's
Hmm.
you know to
Hmm.
put the label of not even evil, but to be afraid is just so natural. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about this other thing, right?
Mm.
My
Right.
fear. So I
Hmm.
noticed that you immediately took a theological perspective on this, and so the assumption is that God is real and that this is spiritual.
Right. So yeah. So I'm allowing the premise there that that um, if we're going to approach it with the kind of terminology of angels and demons, we're kind of going into it with at least the premise that that is the underlying cosmology, that there is a kind of
Mm,
uh, a spiritual element to this, and that you could say that humans themselves have a spiritual element, and therefore anything occurring within the human realm and our experiences can then be looked at as spiritual experiences. Now, I appreciate that some people would say that they don't see that there is any need or place for a spiritual conversation in this. If you have the view that we are in a fully mechanistic, materialist kind of paradigm, obviously
nuts and
they can
bolts,
just
craft.
right, just a priori reject that. I mean, that is I'd say it's a legitimate approach. I'm not saying that people can't approach this topic in that way. Certainly, there's some really great scholars, and researchers who do. I tend to favor, a slightly more metaphysical view. That's just my own, bias. We could
Tell
say
me
is
what you
towards
mean
that.
by that and why you lean that way.
Hmm. Yeah, I do take the view that based on personal experiences, of I say of high strangeness, what I would refer to as kind of psychic experiences. Now,
Mm,
those can be internal, anomalous events, visionary experiences I've had, um, strange knowings, psychical experiences, and also, I guess, the massive reports from other people, which I'm willing to take seriously, particularly
mm,
because of the fact that I've had my own experiences. Obviously, that gives me a bias towards being open minded about other people's high strangeness, right? So
mm,
if I put the two together, my experiences and an acceptance of a very large volume of other people's reports having some level of genuine, kernel to it, that leads me to the at least the working hypothesis that we are in some kind of spiritual framework. That there
mm,
is the very root of all of this. There is something that I would consider a primary consciousness that is inhabits the entire of reality and potentially manifested that reality. Now, I don't know that it would fit to I can't speak for everyone's view of a god or of a prime creator. What do they want to look at this? I can't speak for everyone else, but from my view, yeah, there is something like that that's at the heart of it. And so I admit that I have a bias
mm,
towards that view. And
mm.
again, that's kind of my own personal experiences, plus yeah, an acceptance that we have a very large volume of seemingly mentally well, people that are reporting what I would consider metaphysical and spiritual experiences. And so that's where I lean. Yeah, I definitely lean in that direction.
Well, how would you categorize the experience I had? Because this was crazy. I've been interested in the subject for many years, more years than I realized. Of course, starting with the ancient aliens, and you've been on that program, right?
Yeah, yeah, I've been on. I think it's
Yeah.
about 10, 11 episodes.
That's awesome. So certainly, when I was in high school, I think back to might have even been middle school. I had like a period of a few months where I randomly found some bizarre manifesto online about telepathy and this and that and
Mhm,
spiritual warfare, right?
mhm,
And I got into it for like 3 months trying to meditate and okay, whatever. But uh, so I'm kind of primed to be interested in this kind of stuff, but didn't really
mhm,
have an interest. But over the years, kind of found my way into it. And in the last 2, 3 years, much more. Being active online and seeing all the narratives. Really, okay, it's like okay, this is what we're talking about here. What do I believe here? And um, oh, I suppose I don't really recall where I was going for that with that exactly, but okay, I was going to tell you about what I saw. Right. Thank you.
yeah,
So, so here I am, vaguely interested for sure in
mhm,
concepts of humanity and identity and culture and mythology and creation myths, all that stuff. So this is up my alley, and so I'm becoming more interested over time. And last year, truly about a year ago, it was March 4th, Tuesday, 5:15 a.m. Still dark out. Walking my dog, and I tell you, Bruce,
mhm,
I look up, dark out. over the top of my 5-story apartment building comes a big, bright orange ball, an orb, and
Right.
it's going,
Yeah.
and it's a bright orange ball, and then I see it for 30 seconds, and then it goes through about 15 cycles where the shield, the
Mhm.
orange plasma looking shield goes down, and then it's just a black triangular craft with 3 white circular downlights, and then the shield on and
Mhm.
shield off. And so I don't know, what do you think that was? And does that count?
Mhm.
Would you put that in a metaphysical category or nuts and bolts?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, obviously it's kind of a stunning experience. I imagine it had, a significant impact on you. I mean, when we have these kinds of, intense, seemingly fairly personal interactions with, an inexplicable seeming phenomena, obviously it can feel very personal as well, like that something is there to do something to you, unless, and I've said if we deal with a big group of people and you may look at it differently, but it usually tends to be very, a singular person or a small number of people who have a somewhat intimate, encounter with either an unknown
Mm,
phenomenon in the air or
mm,
the times on the ground. And it does have a feeling of almost that, it's aware of you or that it's there for you. Which, I
mm,
don't know if you'd say that, but it's definitely the common experience. Obviously, the orbs and the triangles with the three lights, again, they are recurring kind of reports that there seems to be um, amongst the, obviously, there's a number of particularly kind of UFOs, but yeah, they're definitely there as being very common. I mean, I've seen some orange orbs myself. Um, but yeah, I still take this view that, are we looking at a genuinely physical craft when we see these kind of, particularly these kind of what seem to be transformations where orb-like objects are described as transforming into,
mhm,
more physical looking crafts? In some
mhm,
cases, people say that they become helicopters and, quite mundane looking things, but they start
mm,
off as
mm,
being peculiar orbs. Now, I have
mm,
a kind of working hypothesis that in at least some large volume of cases where people have, anomalous encounters, that this is a phenomena that is mostly is internal, that there's something happens within the brain,
mhm.
and
If-
that what we see outside isn't necessarily a fully objective reality.
Like a
I
Carl
know we'll
Jung.
probably get into this a bit more, but this idea that, we are having some kind of brain hacking, or there's an energy that is modifying our perceptions.
Mhm,
And there's a phenomenon called, the Oz factor, which is reported quite a lot in UFO cases, which is a sense of that the space that the person is in becomes either, electrically charged or very quiet. All the background sounds vanish. So, it's very common people say the insects, car sounds, everything
mm,
seems to go quiet
right.
while they're having the experience. Now, one explanation for that is the potential that something is modifying the visual and auditory feeds in the brain. And so essentially the real world is being replaced by a feed into the brain, and
Mm,
that the feed replicates all of the surroundings, but it adds in something. So a
mm,
craft, a being, strange events, but often the sound is the clue that this has happened because people report as well, all these other sounds disappeared. I suspect that whatever it is that causes this is not replicating the background sounds because they're not considered important, and that they're the only clue that we get that something is not, not happening externally, but is happening internally. Now, I know that's a strange and perhaps controversial view, and I can't say it is what happened in your case, but when we see these transformations, obviously, I think it's easier to explain a mysterious orb transforming into a craft as something that's happening in our internal world than it is that
mm,
there are, objects like that objectively flying around and that
mhm,
are able to transform between, helicopters, planes, beings. Again and again, we hear these reports of orbs doing that. They seem to be able to just transform into almost anything they want. Of course, there's other explanations, but that's the direction I'm leaning in for a lot of these experiences. Is that we really know if our brain is being interfered with by
mhm.
technologies that would allow, these kind of experiences to appear almost indistinguishable from objective reality, and that goes
What do you
into a
think the
very,
point of that
uncomfortable
would
area.
be? Of some intelligence greater, far greater?
Mhm.
Why imprint an image of a orb and a triangle flying through the sky? Why
Mhm.
that?
Sure. I mean, the whys are always going to be the really tricky ones because if we're dealing with other intelligences, their minds are going to be genuinely alien. So
Mhm.
their manifesto and what they're aiming to do, we can only hazard guesses at. We can say that there is, for some reason, they want us to believe that we are having this kind of, a contact event or a visitation is underway and that we're in this kind of beginnings of some kind of contact. But yet, these experiences seem to go back very deep into our history. So clearly, it doesn't really fit with the idea that something has just arrived from space and is, gradually trying to make contact. It doesn't appear that that's what's happening. So instead, I think we end up in more of the model that has been proposed by, scholars like, Jacques Vallée, who's a very well-known UFO researcher, who, concluded over the years that we seem to be some kind of control system, that there is a kind of a greater matrix, if you like, a matrix of manipulation around consciousness and human development, and that there is, for some reason that we can't quite ascertain, it is almost like trolling us with these experiences of seeing alien beings, of seeing craft, seeing impossible technologies, seeing these transforming plasma orbs. Now, we can't know what it's doing it for, but it seems to be shaping our minds for some kind of event or evolutionary change, that there is something that this is all preparing us for. Now, you could say it's anyone's guess what exactly that is, but I get the feeling that it's kind of accelerating to some near future event. Again, to the prophecy type stuff, but that, yeah, it seems
Mhm.
to be accelerating, and the culture clearly is becoming more open to the idea of non-human intelligences, and we're seeing this very rapidly expanding. So I wonder if that whatever it is these strange experiences are
Mhm.
about is exactly what we're in now, is this kind of paradigm shift towards an acceptance of the idea that there is a non-human intelligence here, be it interdimensional, extraterrestrial, time travel, whatever that exactly is. And again, we can't know that either. We can't know the origin point. So there's a lot of these big question marks where it's like, where are they from? What are they? Um, what are they made of? What are they doing? And those are really, really tricky. So what I tend to think is that first we have to establish that there's a there, right? And how is the if there's a there's something, there's an intelligence. If it exists, and we can establish that, then the next one is, what is it doing to us? Right? What is the mechanisms behind its interactions? Those are the kind of things I think that we can get somewhere with. I think
Mhm.
we can go
Mhm. Mhm.
crazy with some of the other bigger,
Mhm.
what, where, why questions, because
Mhm.
without knowing their mind, if we assume they're like us, and most people do, they assume there's some kind of human-like thinking. I think that could be a really drastic mistake. I mean, I'll give you a scenario for people to think about. I mean, consider that there are aliens out there, and let's say they come from outer space or from another dimension. Doesn't really matter, and that they have some kind of religious system, right? Now, you think about that. Religious systems can be extremely abstract, right? We know there's thousands of, cults and religions on our planet. Now, imagine an alien religion that could be as strange to us as perhaps, that they believe that any life form that has a particular, radiation from it or a particular smell, needs to be modified or needs to be extinguished, or, they can be really
Who knows what
strange
their guiding
motivation.
principles are?
Right, we don't know. You have no idea what their guiding principle is, and they could be so esoteric, so abstract, and just absolutely make no sense to us. And yet, for them, that would be something that's evolved over millions of years to become their guiding principle. So it
Mm.
could be as crazy as a race of beings that destroy anything that's the color red. That's
Mhm.
become their guide. We don't know what the guiding principle of an alien species would be, right? So that's why I think it's easy for people to get kind of make big jumps and say, well, there's something's behaving in this way, ergo, I think it wants to do this. And I think that's really risky at this stage when we still haven't objectively shown that there is a clear, say, physical visitation.
Mhm.
We haven't fully understood the non-physical interactions and to what degree those are generated entirely in human minds, and to what degree they are the effect of something interacting with human minds. And so,
Mm,
we're really quite early. We're at the sort of, from a scientific investigation perspective, we're basically in the philosophy stage, and I'm sure you're aware that a lot of the hard sciences began as philosophy.
mm,
So usually philosophers kind of guide the way, and then eventually a field of science kind of forms. We have guiding questions and ways to explore those. And then technologies are invented to explore them, and there's a whole kind of process that leads to the founding of a real investigative field of science. We're not
mm,
in that. We're, as you point out at the beginning, there's so many aspects to this that if you really think about it, we're still in that, uh, wandering in the dark, grasping for a model, to really get a start on how to investigate some of those questions as to whether we're in a farm, or whether there's all kinds of different beings, whether there's time travelers, whether we're in a holographic reality. We're really still at that philosophical stage where we're asking, what questions can we even ask? You know, what is the important things that we need to start with? That's where we're at, in my view. I don't think we're even anywhere near answering the bigger question. I wish we were. I don't think we're near answering the bigger questions. I mean, I'll pause there a bit, let you reply. But I mean, I think it's important for your listeners to kind of consider that, because often you get
mm.
perspectives from, influential people in these fields, and they seem very certain of where we're at and what's interacting and what's happening to people. And I find that really misleading.
Where do you think? Well, what I want to get to is, okay, point made very beautifully and intelligently. Focus on what you know, write what you know. Focus on the
Mm,
effects that we can see on us. Obviously, we're assuming there's a there. But before I
yeah.
get to that, let me just ask you, what do these prominent people who feel so confident, what's their assertion?
Okay, I'd say one of the most popular models that we've been exposed to is the idea that there are aliens from another world that have arrived here, and that they covet our planet. And so they have some kind of either long-term or medium-term plan to take over our world, but through a manipulation and potentially through hybridizing our species and their species to create a new hybrid race that can move in and take over the planet. And that some of these beings are already on the planet, maybe not only living amongst us, but perhaps amongst our leaders, which with the current events, and
Sure. Yeah.
how crazy some of our leadership seems to be,
Mm,
in these networks of high strangeness. Obviously that is something that I think a lot of people now are considering as a possibility, is that, have we been
hmm
infiltrated? And I'm not going to dismiss that, but that is one model. And that goes with the idea of, say, these gray aliens, that there may be these giant ships. There are a number of different theories to have this idea that there's giant ships behind the moon, or there's a base on the moon,
hmm
that these are essentially invaders that have, they're theorizing the best way to replace us, but they don't want to destroy our planet and our infrastructure. So there's no kind of, guns blazing, spaceships, flying in, blowing us up, because the idea is to kind of take the planet wholesale, that we almost build it for them and hand it over.
mm,
Um,
mm,
Another variant of that is the idea that AI that we are building now is that AI has been kind of given to us through potentially crashed alien spaceships being recovered, and that the technologies have been created from that, including formative AI technologies, and that this AI is housing an alien mind, and that this
mm,
alien mind is, having us build it and build its infrastructure out until it's a certain point where, it just takes over all of our systems in a kind of, like Terminator-ish scenario, but with a alien mind built in, and that there is, we live in a universe of artificial intelligences, and that this is actually the kind of the content they want, is they create a kind of a terrestrial AI that links with these other alien AIs, and that we're really, not of particular interest. We're just helping build out that infrastructure. So kind of a similar idea to what's happening, in terms of that gray argument, but taking it from the approach of, is our artificial intelligence progress entirely human driven, or is that alien driven? And I thought to add
mm,
a side thing to that is to, because people should consider as well, is that if you look at where some of the leading thinkers in sort of NASA and in alien theorists, amongst the kind of the scientific world, is there is a kind of growing consensus that extraterrestrials are most likely to be artificial intelligences. That
mm,
over the long span of time, a race is very likely to build, high technologies, including artificial intelligences, that those intelligences will outlive the biological life forms. And so what you would end up with is like autonomous AI craft exploring the universe who may
Mm,
come from civilizations that have collapsed long ago.
mm,
And what
mm.
remains is all of these
The techno
technologies
signatures, the
essentially,
ghosts, the
right, just
technological
functioning.
ghosts.
Yeah, so we may not have many biological civilizations out there. Maybe thousands and thousands of artificial intelligence civilizations, and that we are
That's
surrounded
yeah.
by them.
That's the evolution, maybe biology to technology.
Right. Yeah. This idea that we're just the cocoon of artificial intelligence. Biology is just, yeah, the birthing organs of artificial
Mm,
intelligence, which is a growing kind of belief in, I say, in academia, is that perhaps that's inevitable. So I think these are really crucial topics for people to consider when we think, what might we be engaging with? Because that is a legitimate, area of thought is, are we even dealing with, anything that's biological at all?
hmm And so, where do you kind of fall? What's your current assessment of the
Mhm.
theory? I know we're talking theories here.
Sure. I mean, I first of all, I'd say that that premise seems very reasonable. So, I mean, I would imagine that assuming life has been somewhat common, across the universe,
hmm
that in most of the galaxies, I would guess that there are more artificial intelligence types, civilizations than there are biological in terms of like high tech civilizations. There's probably a lot more biological, simple life, and simple organisms and all that kind of stuff. But probably in terms of spacefaring or really high tech civilizations, I imagine that we're going to be dealing with a universe with far more AI than biological civilizations. Um, in terms of what's happening in our own solar system, you know, I do see evidence, obviously through my own work particularly, that we've had contact in the past and that there's physical traces of that contact. So I would estimate that we've had at least one alien species that has interacted with this planet at the minimum, one. And that fits with some basic statistics, which is that if you look at the percentage chance of something to contact us, even if you take the idea that says 100 civilizations in the Milky Way, and they've been around for 10 billion years or whatever you want, that's plenty of time for them to have explored the whole of the galaxy, especially through using probes, and maybe people are put into stasis or they have long lives, however you want to look at it. There's been enough time for craft to visit all of the worlds of the Milky Way from just a handful of civilizations that if they're determined to do that, to explore, that they could have done that at sub-light speeds. So that's without invoking faster than light or wormholes, that there has been sufficient time to do that. In about a million years, really, you can have the whole of our galaxy has been visited by probes or craft. Now, what's very unlikely is that aliens turn up here right at the moment that we develop spacefaring technologies. So, this idea that the aliens have turned up in the 19 sort of 40s, um, is super unlikely. And it's one of the reasons why most sort of academic scholars reject this premise and believe that, that what we're seeing is a cultural contagion, an idea that we've become aware of space, we've developed a space program, science fiction boomed, and that now people are kind of hallucinating alien visitors because they just think statistically the likelihood of beings turning up from space right at that moment, out of all the moments that it could have occurred, is so
hmm
unlikely. Whereas the the chances of a visitation somewhere in the last 4.5 billion years, you will find that a lot of those same scholars will say, actually, we're quite open to that. We think that that's reasonably likely, that in fact, we should have seen a visitation to Earth in that time. In fact, that's why we have
hmm
the whole idea of there's a paradox, right? About where
hmm
are all the aliens. That paradox comes from the belief that
hmm
statistically, Earth
hmm
should have been visited at least once in the last 4.5 billion years. So there's two very different perspectives. One is visitation recently, that's seen as essentially close to 0% chance. A visitation somewhere in the time that the Earth has existed, that's considered very reasonable and probably should have happened if there's the number of civilizations that are expected to be out there. And so that's where I think that my work actually is somewhat different and is more acceptable to a lot of scholars, just that premise, not necessarily that they agree with more evidence, but the very premise that we've had a prehistoric visitation. The other thing about prehistoric visitation, of course, is that the evidence becomes some of it fragmented and difficult to see. So no one expects to see immediately, very obvious signs of that visitation because you have to scour for it. Like, if things crashed on the moon, we need to scour the moon, and check to see if any time in the last few billion years something has crashed. Now that hasn't been done in the intensity we'd like. Obviously, there's imaging of the moon, but not at the scale we'd like. Small pieces of debris and stuff. We're not going to have seen them, right? That's something that's being explored, but it's not being done. So I'm at the premise where I think that we have this evidence of a visitation about 800,000 years ago, and I've got some friends of my own work, and that there are traces for that. Now, I want to put that in before saying anything else. I don't actually see any very compelling evidence for a visitation at any other time. So, in that respect, I probably, there's a lot of people who would disagree with me, and they are very convinced that what we're seeing in this modern, contact report kind of phenomena and the ufology is
Last
that we're
100 years.
seeing really clear evidence of visitation. I don't agree with that. I think that it's very much based around, subjective cases. I would say it's nearly entirely subjective, and that where we have some traces, it's things like, landing cases where perhaps there's a depression in the ground, where the person said they saw something, or there is, someone has a burn on them and they say that it's radiation from a craft. But if you were to just look at the evidence in itself, and you think about it, and if you walked into a field and just saw a depression in the ground, and there was a bit of radiation traces, you wouldn't say to me, I think an alien spaceship landed here. So that is in no sense is it compelling evidence, right? It takes that story. It still always relies on the story from an individual who we don't know whether or not they were being honest. We don't know if they were cognitively impaired in some way. We don't know if there's not something else that causes people to hallucinate these experiences. And that's why I say that despite so many people arguing that we have overwhelming objective evidence of alien visitation today, I would say that the only case I'm aware of where that is really strong is from this event 800,000 years ago. Now, I'm quite happy for you to push back on that or ask more on that, but that's where I'm at. I just don't find that these cases today are anywhere near as compelling as they're being put to us, whether Roswell or,
That's
any
interesting
of them.
because there is this groundswell, people getting carried away. And I'm one of them going, wait a minute, people are putting together all these presentations about this case and throughout the
Hmm.
decades. And all of a sudden it kind of looks compelling. You're not
Hmm.
convinced. You're skeptical about contemporary modern sightings, but pretty high conviction on ancient 800,000 years ago interacting
Hmm.
with the species and genetic alterations.
Yeah, exactly. And the reasoning for that is now I'll give a little bit of background. So I'm not trying to say that, I know for a fact there isn't any, physical visitation today. I'll just clarify that, again, I just look at the individual cases that I've explored, and not one of them leads me at the end to be compelled to think that it involved a physical extraterrestrial visitation. And the other thing is that what we shouldn't do is say, well, there's all these cases, therefore that proves it. Whereas, what you have to do is look individually at each case, right? Because, you
Hmm.
know, just because, if 1,000 people told you that there was a unicorn farm in the forest, you'd want to still see that unicorn farm,
Right.
right? Or some video evidence of it, or a unicorn bone, or something. That we have to kind of treat it the same way. That all these stories don't add up if they individually don't hold up. That we need to make sure that when we say we're going to use 50 cases, those 50 cases were rigorously explored, and that on their own they have the merits of indicating to us that aliens were involved, right? And I think that when you explore the cases that people are relying on, I don't get to a conclusion at the end of them that aliens were involved in those. I'm not saying they weren't, but they're
Right.
not
But
so compelling that you have to say they were.
no
Um,
eureka moment. Yeah.
right. The difference with the work I'm doing, and I'll give a very brief background on how that came about, and it is a strange case. And again, I don't think we should ever expect a case involving aliens or hypothetically involving aliens to be totally mundane and easy to accept. So I'm going to preface that should we expect aliens to be reasonable, or should they seem alien? So in other words, having
Hmm.
some high strangeness involved isn't shouldn't be
So
off-putting to
strange.
people,
Right.
right? So the case that I got involved with is a claimed encounter with an artifact, or a piece of what I think is potentially technology, an artifact called a Chiringa. So
Mm,
this is a sacred Aboriginal artifact. There is a lot of lore around these. There's a mob or a tribe that's called the Arente people in the sort of central north deserts of Australia. Now, they have this part of their belief system around the dreaming or the Alcheringa, which is this is a nebulous concept. For people who are not too familiar with the dreaming or dream time, it's a all-encompassing term that involves their cosmology, history, their spirituality, their laws of how they live, and their lore. So LORE and LAW. But these are all bundled under like a singular concept of dreaming. So it's
mm,
really hard to explain, and really it doesn't mesh very well with Western concepts of reality. But within that dreaming lore, there is this story that in the beginning time, in the creation time, when the earth was kind of was modified, at least by spirit beings, that animals were
mm,
being made, that there's this creation of humans, and that there are these powerful beings, these Alcheringa beings. And one of the things that some of these beings do is, apart from having a role in creating humans, is that they either create these Chiringas or they transform themselves into Chiringas. Now, a Chiringa essentially is a small, like a hand, can be a handheld size kind of usually a stone or sometimes wooden artifacts, right? So if you imagine a lozenge, probably about a foot across, half a foot wide and a few inches thick. So, they're not large. So the ones we know, there's a lot of somewhat modern, somewhat modern Chiringas. Okay, there's all sorts of them, wooden ones, stone ones. But in their lore, there are these original Chiringas that were made by these beings, or were the beings transformed into impermeable forms, but that remained sentient and were
mm,
essentially living archives, receptacles of information, and that had this powerful aura that meant that wherever they were kept, the surrounding area was impacted and the whole area would be considered sacred. And if there was ever, say, a fight between
mm,
two people, it has to stop when they got too near to where these things are being kept, because the whole area becomes sacred. The emanations from it
mm,
are even considered sacred. And that these have this strange kind of overlap with a class of technologies that were theorized from as early back as the 1960s by a chap called Ronald Bracewell, right? So Ronald Bracewell was one of the formative kind of thinkers in the SETI world. So back in 1960, there was kind of an initial meeting about, of different scientists over how we could look for aliens. And, at the time they just developed their kind of radio telescope technologies and stuff. So it kind of felt natural that they could look for radio signals, right? But Bracewell was saying, well, look, I think it's much more likely that super advanced civilizations would be using autonomous probes. Keep in mind, this is before AI, but he'd
mm,
come up there. So it's very likely you'd get to a point where your computer technologies are at a point where you can have sort of sentient or semi-sentient autonomous probes that you would send out. And it's likely that advanced civilizations would encounter each other and over time form networks that continue to expand by sending out these probes. And so there's a particular class of them called the Bracewell Sentinel probe. And for people who want a kind of an easy vision of one, just think of 2001: A Space Odyssey, because very near the beginning you see one, and that's the obelisk, right? The black
mm,
obelisk that's standing there.
mm,
That is a Sentinel probe. So it's an autonomous artificial intelligent technology that can sit on a planetary surface and encounter the life forms there and either monitor them, acting as a sentinel, monitoring them over time, or making contact as an ambassador for the civilization that sent it, if there's a civilization suitably advanced enough to activate that autonomous ambassador role within the probe. Now, okay, that's an interesting concept, but so then we think again of this. So this story, the Arente story, these artifacts. So they are set to be, prehistoric artifacts that were either created by or inhabited by the intelligence of a non-human, intelligent race that was on our planet in prehistory, that had some role in modifying our species, and that is still there, present through these artifacts up to the present day. kept as super sacred artifacts. Now, I know it's a
Hmm.
long preamble, but the reason I say it is because there was an encounter between a small group of people in Australia back in 1994 with one of these artifacts that came out of a. I'll do a very brief on this backstory, but wanted to
Take your
add. Sorry, I want
time.
to add one
Let it
other
breathe.
sentence there
Yeah.
quickly as well. Yeah, is that so one of the claims from the Arente elders is that the original Turingas, the ones that were genuinely, from the beginning, were lost to time and they don't know where those ones are. That what they have is copies, but
Hmm.
they consider those copies to be just as sacred and just as special as the original ones. But the original ones were lost.
Hmm.
Now, I think that one of these original ones has turned up because what happened was, from my understanding, it's about 1870, a camel trader stumbled on a cave out near Uluru in the central desert, and he found one of these Churingas inside. In the story I was told, it seemed to have some sort of luminosity to it. It stood out in the darkness. He picked it up. He took it. He tried to give it to the local Aboriginal tribe. They didn't want it. They were scared of it. And again, this is part of the Arente law: is that they're not supposed to handle these things. They're not supposed to look at them. Only the high elders are supposed to do that. Again, think of the Ark of the Covenant. Very similar kind of story, actually. That
That's what I've been
they're
thinking
not
of. Yeah.
supposed to be right. They're dangerous. They're not meant to be handled. They're communication technologies to some higher power. Nobody except for the high elders wants anything to do with them. And there's taboos where they can be blinded for touching one or
Hmm.
even put to death. So you can imagine they weren't that pleased to see this thing turning up because, it's not something they could just handle. He didn't understand that. But so he ended up keeping this thing and it was passed down in his family until the early 90s when the current custodian of it tried to have it given back to the Aboriginal people. And so this was given to a lady who was working in Aboriginal media at the time. And she basically was approached by the custodian of it and asked, could you potentially get this back? We know that, you've got contacts in the Aboriginal community. And she herself had been initiated into carpet snake dreaming, so into a path of
Hmm.
initiation. And had asked her, would you be able to try and get this back? My family would really like it to go back to its real custodian. We know it's some kind of sacred artifact. We shouldn't really have it. And so she agrees to do this. Um, Soon after that, she's quite unwell and she gives it to a lady called Valerie Barrow to look after temporarily. Valerie is a person who, by her own claims, had had many psychic and strange experiences in her life. And shortly after this thing comes into her house, she starts hearing a voice. Again, this is her claim, so it's subjective. She's saying she's hearing this voice, and it starts telling her that it's a person, it's a non-human intelligence, a star person, and that it's this artifact was left here by visitors in the deep past, and that there's a whole lost history of humanity recorded in it. And it starts telling her about a craft that came here, destruction of this craft, survivors that came down, a modification of the ancestral beings on this planet, and details of a multi-directional asteroid bombarding the planet, which is carried out by technologies like really like sci-fi, Star Wars, like kind of crazy, like crazy sounding stuff on the face of it,
Hmm.
right? So I read her book. Let me think. So 2013, 2012, 2013. And what really stood out to me was the scale of these events. So apart from the fact that, having looked into these Turingas, I was quite captivated. So I thought, well, these sound a lot like Sentinel probes. That, if a race left something on our planet, what would the people who held it say about them? Well, probably what the Arente say, that, this is this weird sentient object that we keep in a
Hmm.
cave and that we're all scared of, but it seems to be full of knowledge, right?
Hmm.
And so it has the exact story around it we'd
It's
expect.
like a
And
Siri.
then
It's
we
like an iPhone.
right. So yeah, it's like if you imagine you drop the iPhone into a printer script, what would they say about it? This magic mirror that sometimes when they
Like a
rub it, it
genie.
lights
Yeah.
up and
Yeah.
it talks and stuff. I think it's very much like that. You drop the iPhone in, so they form a story, around it, a mythology of this being
Hmm.
sacred. And this story that it gives Valerie and some associates of hers that are involved, it basically gives so many big details. I realized that you could check this. You can look at the academic kind of studies in these kind of relevant fields and see whether or not there was anything to this, or if it's just sci-fi. And I kind of set myself the rule that, if at least one of the big claims in that story didn't stack up, then I would just consider it, an interesting story. Maybe it was real, maybe not, but hey, not for me. I've got other things to do. To be honest, just published a book with a forward from Graham Hancock, The Forgotten Exodus, was doing really well. And so it was kind of like, do you write book 2 of that? And I'm sure you can imagine if you in my shoes, you've got
Mm.
essentially, the biggest name in the ancient mysteries field is, tweeting out your book and it's doing really well. And you've got this other project on your desk. So you can do either book 2, follow through, and it should probably do really well, or this crazy story about this alien visitation. And like
Mm.
Graham himself said, when you go down the alien road, it's handing a big stick to the opponents to beat you with. Because it's so controversial, it's so easy to attack, right? So I had to really weigh it up. But as I explored this, I found that the first thing that I found was that in their claims of this giant ship coming and being destroyed, it says that this thing is like a sentient AI, a very large sentient AI mothership, not made but grown. And today we'd call that 3D printing, right? But back
Mm.
in the 90s, 3D printing wasn't a thing, right? So this
Mm.
lady somehow she's describing a 3D printed sentient AI craft, things that today we can easily visualize. But
Mm.
in 1994, again, these weren't really concepts. And that this thing, when it was destroyed, it melts and this glassy material rained down across the planet. And I'd never heard of anything that meshed with that. So that sounds like totally wild, right? And as I began to dig into it, I found that actually there is a kind of a mystery around this material called Australasian tektite. And the Australasian tektite strewn field is a large field of debris that stretches all the way from China down to Antarctica. So about 12,000 kilometers of glass that rained down from the
Mm.
sky, of a molten silica glass, about 80% silica, that rained down 788,000 years ago
Mm.
and forms part of this mysterious event. So the first you're thinking is, well, okay, so I'm looking to see if there was ever a rain, a massive rain of melted silica that occurred, in the story it says, in her story, she says somewhere towards 900,000 years ago, right? So this isn't quite to that, but 788,000 years ago isn't wildly out from that. So I think, well, that's kind of intriguing. It seems like there really was something that could mesh with that. So that was like strike one. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting enough to,
Mm.
keep digging. The second one that turned up was the multi-directional impact claims, because there's a claim that in this information she says she was given, it says that 5 years afterwards there's a kind of a follow-up event with some other crafts, and that they redirect these asteroids at our planet and they destroy underground facilities that exist on the planet at that time. Now, I thought, well, if that was real, surely we'd all heard of it. We know all about, the event for the dinosaurs, these a big story. We all know about that. But I've never heard of a multi-directional asteroid impact event, any time in prehistory. I thought, well, that'd be big news. We'd all know that. And the thing is, actually, it turned out that that was only discovered in 2016. And so this is kind of
Mm.
in the time when I'm, started researching this. So when I first read that book, that wasn't even known. So this actually came about long after these events, and long after she published these events, and even after I became involved, that they discovered that in fact 790,000 years ago, approximately, at least 3 or 4 objects, maybe 5 objects, impact our planet from space from different
Mm.
directions, with impacts in Tasmania, Southeast Asia, Central America, possibly Canada, and also seemingly in Antarctica, but all at the same time. And this isn't this isn't a fragmenting comet, right? Each one of these
Mm.
debris sites has a different chemical signature. So they know that these are not one object breaking up. These are separate objects coming in from different sides and impacting our planet. Now, you can imagine at that point, I'm like, well, this is getting really weird now, because we've got billions of tons of molten silica falls from the sky. And at the same time now, we're being told there's also a multi-directional impact event, which
Mm.
both on their own are strange events. When we think about it, those are really strange things. So even if you had no story you were working from, you'd have a bit of a head scratcher. You know what I mean? Like, what would make lots of asteroids suddenly hit our planet from different directions? Or what the heck kind of event leads to billions of tons of silica raining down, over 12,000 kilometers apart. I mean, there's nothing else like that in the history of the planet. We don't know of any other event on that scale in terms of debris fields, right? Just to clarify that, that's not typical of an impact.
Mhm.
Um, and then, of course, the third point was this idea that there's an intervention. They describe survivors of this event realizing that they can't complete their original aim, which was essentially a colonization and a handover of our planet, that there's another group here, a hostile group, that there's a negotiated handover that's being betrayed. The craft is being destroyed. They can no longer do this colonization plan. And they come up with this secondary plan, which is to modify a hominin that lives here and essentially nudge it towards their thinking and their aims and do what I would call a colonization by proxy. It seems to be more important to them to have their ideology, their philosophy of thinking, and even their religion potentially here on this planet than them themselves. So that doesn't seem to be as important. So they decide actually this can be done by modifying the hominins and making the hominins more like them. And so they carry this allegedly, carry this out. So I thought, well, if that is true, we'd be able to see evidence of that in the genome, you know, particularly, we're living in an age where the human genome has been, like fully sequenced. We have mounds and mounds of, studies that deal with, the underlying genomics that makes humans different from other primates and all that stuff. So, we have no shortage of that. And the thing is, because I just ran a book about hominins and human origins, right? Just before that, so published in 2017. I was quite aware of the academic literature in that field, right? So I already knew that there had been a gradual movement of dates for when the first kind of large-brained humans, and particularly the Homo sapiens lineage, had first emerged out of older kind of Homo erectus and archaics, and that date had been getting pushed further back. So if you'd gone back to when this case happened, Valerie's case, at that time, the belief was that our lineages, Neanderthals and us, had split from older primitive hominins somewhere around sort of 500,000 years ago. And then around 300,000 years ago, Neanderthals and us had split, so it was all much more recent. But when you get to sort of 2017, when I'm kind of doing this work, it'd been pushed back by discoveries of the Denisovan genome. And so there was an understanding that actually this had to have happened much earlier. And the dates that were coming up was sort of 550 to 750,000 years ago. And since then, that has been gradually more and more refined. And eventually it has settled on that this is happening somewhere in this sort of 750 to 800,000 years ago.
Mm.
Now, if you think about that, that's right again on that time we're talking about. So 788,000 years ago for this silica debris, about 790 for the multiple impact events. And now we're looking at the genomic signatures for our divergence at somewhere in the 750 to 800,000 years. So once you put those three together, and again, individually, each is an anomalous, strange set of events. But then if you align three of them together, well, then you're compounding the weirdness. Because now you've got to say, well, what the heck is going on 790,000 years ago if we have, this strange tektite event with billions of tons of debris falling from the sky, we have this strange multi-directional impact event, and we have the already considered anomalous sudden acceleration of human brain size and a divergence of our lineage away from Homo erectus. Now they're all occurring in the same point in time. So once for me, once I got to that, I'm like, well, that's basically shows that this is very likely to be real information because it's not
So,
leading me to nothing. It's leading me to scientific data.
mm, so is the theory then is the best possible explanation for those three events? The, did I understand correctly that there was a hostile, if you will,
Hmm.
non-human intelligent species on this earth already
Yeah.
coexisting with the primates, our ancestors, who fought
Hmm.
the others and who melted their ship and it
Hmm.
fell to the ground in billions of tons of silica, and
Hmm.
there was an asteroid uh, bombardment as a result of this war between these two advanced
Yeah.
species, and it was in part, at least, over our existence, and the others decided to retreat and infiltrate via proxy rather than. Is that basically the story?
Yeah, essentially it. And I would say that how it's described is their drivers, again, that they have a philosophical or theological element to this. That apart from it seems to be some like legalese, a belief that this planet had been at some point under the, let's say, under the at least the control of this second group, and that this planet had apparently been taken, I guess, aggressively by a second party
You're talking about the
at some
hostiles?
point. So this hostile group at some point, yeah, have seized this planet from some kind of um, union of different species that's out there. So it does go to this idea of that, potentially, Bracewell suggested that other civilizations network, that they know each other, that there's not just one species on one side and one species on the other. That what it
Mm.
describes is kind of networked groups. That there is a hostile group that's at least, from what I can remember, at least two different species involved, and this other party that turns up here believing that they've negotiated a hand over the planet. That they are they're described as being multiple different species, including
Infighting,
robotic.
infighting in the network.
So there's various species that seem to know each other. That this is the description we're given. That this isn't just one lot against one another. That there's networks of beings that either collaborate, that are some benevolent, some neutral, some hostile. That it's actually quite complicated, and
Hmm.
that this planet has exchanged hands more than once,
Mm.
and that these beings, the hostile group, are described as having had a role in creating the first hominins, and that so that we're really not even a natural species from the outset. That this is already
Mm.
a species that's been manipulated from the ape-like ancestors, and is so Homo erectus would be an already engineered species. So
Can
the
we
second
attach?
intervention.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Can we attach some, or is it just totally inappropriate to do this? Can we talk? Can we think about the people who had their spaceship melted as the Greys, and the people who were here? The people that's
Mhm.
the beings as the Greys who got their spaceship melted, and the beings that modified the original. And maybe even before that, who were the hostile group who melted their spaceship as mantids. Help us visualize who these
Yeah,
characters
sure.
are.
Well, I think it's easier on the one side, which is on the hostile side, because they are described as being a somewhat familiar type, and that's they're given this kind of a reptilian form. And obviously, the reptilian form recurs again and again, not only in modern kind of UFO lore, but in older beliefs around a number of cultures around the planet, and of course, to some degree, even in theological ideas that that there are these reptilian type beings seems to occur in both in cultural law and some religious systems. We have kind of representations of reptilian humanoids, even like the Ubaid culture from about sort of 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, that we seem to have this motif of humanoid but reptilian-like beings. In UFO contact law, yeah, of course, that's a recurring theme. Unfortunately, in many ways, it's perhaps the form that causes the most knee-jerk, like, oh God, here we go, reptilians. So I almost hate to bring up, but that is how it's described, that there is a group here that at least the majority of them would fit a kind of reptilian profile, and that they are this hostile group. The other parties include a range of beings, some from what I understand from talking to Valley, who's passed on now, but that some of them were described as being somewhat like the Greys in terms of, yeah, large-headed and big eyes, but also some of these other human-like types with the elongated heads, and that I think would probably be closer to what's described like Nordic, and that look more human, but not Nordic in the way that sometimes you see pictures that just look like Swedish people in blue outfits. And I know
Little
you.
different, slightly different.
Right, you've probably seen this some like that. So not quite like that. I mean, definitely alien, elongated heads, taller than normal humans, a strange kind of bluish, grayish, pearlish kind of color skin. So yeah, but more or less human-like. and then there are described robots and like silica-based entities, kind of living silica housed in robotic suits, and so some strange kind of collection of different kinds of entities on this other craft that arrives. So it is really a mixed bunch, and again, of course, subjective. That's what's said is there, but that's described as being a really a mixed bunch of entities involved. Um, so we have obviously a complex kind of narrative there. Now, of course, I can't support that those beings were there. I can't support that there was that this particularly was reptilian form beings. What we can say is that the description of the events, the major events, those have tangible evidence for them, right? I
Mm-hmm.
can't say to you that therefore everything else in this is accurate. I don't know that. But what it does say to us is if an intelligence exists outside of the earth, now it doesn't really matter whether that's spiritual or extraterrestrial, but if you were to have contact with an intelligence that claimed to know more about the cosmos and more about our planet than we do, that intelligence should be able to transfer to you information about places, events, or history that you wouldn't know, right? But
Mm-hmm.
that it would, and that it could be validated to show that you were talking with a genuine higher intelligence, right? So I see that as the very basic standard for saying, are we really talking with something else out there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Mm.
with most of the case, in fact, let's be honest, with virtually all the cases to do with aliens, where there's messengers that are given, it's never something that we can go away and have a scientist validate. They don't really say, this is how you build a warp drive. And then an engineer builds a warp drive. And we say, just like in, the movie Contact, where they
Mm-hmm.
send the design for the wormhole
Mm-hmm.
travel chair, right?
Mm.
And they build the chair and it's a wormhole travel. So then you're talking to aliens, right? So in this case, the base conclusion that I can offer from it is that it appears there is a genuine intelligence that for some reason was associated with this artifact, this Chiringa. And at the very least, it was aware ahead of time that our species split from our ancestral species at the same moment in time as a multi-directional bombardment of asteroids that we didn't know about, and also at the same time as this rain of silica debris that we know is mysterious but existed, and somehow knew that these three events not only occurred but occurred together.
Mm.
Everything else beyond that is subjective, right? And in the premise that if it's told us that stuff and it knows that, and if it seems to have been truthful about that, then to what degree do we extend it the courtesy of some level of belief that other things it is telling us are also true? Now, I can't tell anyone to what degree they would go with that, because you might say, well, I don't want to trust anything further than what's validated, right? Which is fine. Or you say, okay, well, let's hear it out. What's the other things it's saying?
I'm a
And the other
type
things
B
it's
guy.
saying
Yeah,
is
let's
that.
hear it out. Yeah.
Right. So the other things it's saying is, well, not only is this bombardment, but this is caused by this visitation, this giant ship, the destruction of this ship by these reptilians on your planet, that we've had a toing and froing about this planet with them, that there is a legal dispute about ownership of this planet, that your species is not a naturally evolved species. It was manipulated from its outset by beings on this planet, that we have intervened and we have changed the direction of evolution towards what we think is better, which is towards their view of the universe and their behavior, their thinking,
Mm.
again, from I suppose if you take it the theological view, making us like them, that seems to be what they do. And that both sides have some kind of ongoing influence on this planet, that this isn't a story that's concluded and that they've all just left us alone, that there's no particular reason to think that. Instead, that we have manipulating forces of at least two different categories ongoing. In amongst the story as well, I want to add a couple of things as well. There's a couple of things that actually are worth mentioning, because Another thing they say is that they gave us and taught us fire and construction, right, with wood and stuff. That they showed us how to build wooden.
They being the hostile ones.
Sorry, no, the more benevolent group that has modified humans.
Hmm. Got it.
That they say that amongst the things they do when they're here after this event of creating us is a kind of a period of shepherding these new humans, teaching them, showing them how to cook, to use fire, to build wooden
Hmm.
constructions, and really starting to set them off on the course towards complex culture, which of course will lead to civilization.
Mm.
And one of the things that's turned up from that, again, so for things that seem to validate is, and I don't know if you know this, but very recently, last couple of years, they found evidence in the Levant region. There's a site where basically it looks like the first fully controlled use of fire for cooking. So
Mm.
repeated use of fire, maybe meaning that they knew how to make fire rather than collecting fire, but also that controlling the temperature to cook food in a way that's unlike just wildfires and whatnot. That there's bones and other things there that suggest the first fully controlled use of fire. But that's dated to 780,000 years ago. Right. So
Mm.
again, you're right on that same time when we're being told that they're doing this stuff. The other thing that has come up as well is that at that same site, there is the earliest signs of using wood in engineering. We don't know exactly what's used for, but there's some kind of smoothed wood, maybe planks, what they're being found in the same site. But we also
Mm.
know that there's been discoveries of wood engineering, and you probably saw this in a place in Africa. I think it's at 500 and something thousand years old. So the engineering of wood, which a few years ago, we had no evidence for wood engineering going, beyond a few thousand years, has been pushed back to 500 to 780,000 years, right? So we're
Mm.
starting to get to where, hang on, this is looking a lot closer to what they've told us these years ago, which would have sounded totally just outside the ballpark. And if you think about it, one of the things I take out is if someone's going to make up a story, again, if we were to say the people involved were just making this up, why make up things that are so wildly outside of what's known in the science, right? Why say that they're building wooden constructions 780,000 years ago if the
Why go for
oldest
the
known wooden
outlier?
constructions are
Right.
right 10,000? Why even say it? Why say the
Hmm.
fire is being used? Why say it? Why say that that there is asteroid bombardments? At the same time,
Mm.
why include these elements? Because what you're actually doing is setting yourself up to fail. If you
Mm.
knew you were lying,
Mm.
you try and keep your story somewhat minimized and within what could pass for being true and what couldn't too easily be debunked, but
Mm.
also is within the known, things that you've learned, maybe in obscure books, but things that you could know that maybe other people don't. And you build your narrative around that. I find it quite telling that when someone says, well, what they've said is there's a multi-directional impact, and that turns out years later to be accurate. That what they say is fire was being used, and then years later we're seeing, well, actually, it seems like fire was controlled at that time, and that
Mm.
they were using wood for their structures, and now we're finding wood being used in engineering at that time, like wildly earlier than anyone thought in the 90s. Nobody was anywhere near these ideas. So it's not just the main events. It looks like some of the smaller details are now starting
Mm.
to pan out as well. So for me, that
Mm.
is even more compelling because it's like a lot of the stuff you can't validate, but these areas are starting to also look true, and we're also starting to understand that intelligence is happening in terms of let's say complex intelligence in humans and some degree of recursive thinking is occurring way earlier, and that this it used to be the belief that really the intelligence of humans kind of manifested 200 1,000 years ago, but we're not seeing that. We're now seeing you if you follow these topics, you've probably seen that they found wooden spears going back 500,000 years. They found percussion hammers in England from about 500,000 years ago that suggest
Mm.
multi-step tool fashioning using these soft percussion hammers to do better edges. From five, take again some degree of recursive thinking. So you've got to think. We need the tool. It has to be like this. The tool has to have the edge done. You start to get so many steps that it
Mm.
shows the intelligence of these humans is far greater than we thought. And so it looks like the leap to um, complex, higher thinking is happening much closer to that split with the Homo erectus than we thought. So it looks like really and then the other thing that goes with that is that we're finding that a very large number of the anomalies that differentiate us from other primates, and we assume from other hominins, are occurring at 780,000 years ago. And that, one of them is, and I know we didn't go too much into this, but I should go a bit into the genomics, because we know that around that point there is the chromosome 2 fusion event, right? And this has been for a very long time. Again, this is another thing actually, yeah, that has changed in the time since the book, her book came out and her work was revealed, and to when I began investigating this, something that has changed is the understanding of the chromosome 2 fusion. So people that aren't familiar with this, humans have 46 chromosomes, right? All the other primates have 48 chromosomes. We believe that Homo erectus and all the other hominins, that existed in, 2 million years ago or more, that they all had 48 chromosomes. And for quite a long time, there's been a debate as to when exactly did these two chromosomes fuse, these ancestral chromosomes, and give us this 46 chromosomes, right? And they knew that it had to have been, well, going back a few years, they realized it had to have been before the split with Neanderthals, and then they realized it also Denisovans. So they said, okay, it looks like Neanderthals and Denisovans have the same as us. Okay, so well, then that the fusion has happened at least at the beginning of that lineage, right? Before they all diverged. They didn't know if it was lots earlier, somewhere closer to the split with ancestors of chimpanzees. So that was unknown. So somewhere in the last 7 million to, around 800,000 years ago. But in the last few years, particularly, they've narrowed that down to where the general view is it's happening somewhere in the sort of 900 to 800,000 years ago, with a greater preference for close to 800,000 years ago. Okay, so again, now you're onto that same area that we've been talking about, that we have a fundamental change in humans that is not understood, and it seems to play a role in the origins of all these large-brained humans. And it occurs right in that window that we've been talking about. And again, that science has been sliding over the years, certainly since the 90s, where it was very poorly understood. Genomics just wasn't as advanced as it is now. And as well as that, they've understood now that there are a series of types of anomalies that underlie our brain. And if you're happy with me, just quickly, I'll give people a quick overview of these anomalies. So, right, the things that make us different from other primates are especially concentrated in non-coding DNA. So that's what used to be called junk DNA in the genome, right? So these are areas that don't code for don't code for proteins stuff, but what they do is they seem to control genetic expression and regulate genetic expression. So you'll have code that will perhaps turn on or off a gene's function, or will change the degree to which that gene expresses what it does. So it could change the the length of your arms, or it could make you have no arms, right? It could just turn off those genes to do that. So these are very important segments of code. And when they looked across all the different mammals and compared this non-coding DNA, what they found is that there are areas that are considered to be super stable or like hyper stable that have been essentially unchanged for tens or hundreds of millions of years. In humans, they detected sequences that had been drastically accelerated. And so these are called human accelerated regions, right? Over 50% of these HARs are to do with the brain. They have functions to do with the brain, particularly fetal brain development. So changes in the stage when we're still a fetus or early infancy, when the brain is under its greatest development. It seems that these areas of code are particularly active at those times. And then they discovered, a little bit more recently, they discovered what's called human conserved deletions. And again, so in these highly stable areas of code, they are found point deletions, so very short deletions, not many DNA letters that have been removed. And the expectation is that when you have something like that these should be really bad, so called deleterious. These should be problems, because this is code that's doing really important stuff in all the mammals, right? So in all the others, it's stable. In ours, segments of code had vanished. And so they said, well, the kind of crazy thing is, instead of it causing problems, these areas of code that happened to vanish allowed other segments of code to interact, and that they play crucial roles in the differentiation of our brain from the other primates. right? So
Mm,
now you've got another set of anomalous code, right? You've got
mm,
the chromosome 2 fusion, again, which is a strange event. And
mm,
the type of end-to-end telomere to telomere fusion that we have is, as far as I can understand it, is either not present in any other animals or is possibly present in about one or two other species. So, although you get chromosomal errors, these telomere to telomere fusions are not normal. Like, it's a very strange fusion.
mm,
Um, and then you have very recently, another class of anomalies called hackers, and it's kind of in the name that they're thinking how profound these are. Um, HAQERS, which is a human ancestor quickly evolved regions, and these are um,
mm,
code that appears out of nowhere. So they call it like out of the dark genome or a
mm,
genomic Big Bang, right? Because they said that
mm,
this is not where code has changed, like with the HARs. They say novel code appeared and
mm,
has amazing benefits for the brain and seems
mm,
to be inactive between about 800 to 500,000 years ago and then basically turned off. So it's like it helped change our brain, give us this brain, and then it just deactivates. It said, unlike most code that has high risks and problems because it's mutations, that this just seemed almost like a wonderful gift from nature. That suddenly we had all this new code that was super beneficial, ran its course, and then becomes
mm,
inactive. So we're getting to a point where there's so much strangeness in the human genome when contrasted with other mammals that it's enough that some of the people that I collaborate with, there's some just say there's some geneticists in the US from a couple of different universities that are starting to help look at some of this and formulate some potential experiments and investigations we can do, because while they won't, they're not at the point of saying this has to be aliens, but the things that's being seen are mysterious enough, strange enough to open the valid question of, well, can this be something that's being done to us? Why is it that humans seem to have all of these anomalies and that we don't see them in other mammal species? So there's enough there to say, well, we can't dismiss the idea of an intervention, and the dating of that sudden acceleration of the brain, which is seen in the fossil record. It's long been known that occurs at 800,000 years ago because of the fossil record, but now we're seeing in the genome
mm.
that there are all kinds of strange changes that are associated with us becoming this large, complex brained, creature that we are. And so when you put those together, it starts to look very close to what we're being told occurred, that that there is seemingly something that's different about us, and it seems to date back to that same period.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you for that. Seriously, every word was worth listening to. You laid it
So
all out there, and so much to chew on. So wow. I mean, are we kind of the flashpoint between different races of higher non-human intelligences, and has the
mhm,
planet changed hands, and is that what's going on? I mean, it's a cosmic um, war, a cosmic custody battle, a
mhm,
cosmic intervention. It's absolutely incredible to think about, and to consider that it's not just the crafts and all the lore behind that, and
mhm.
but also the genome, that there's evidence,
Yeah.
and the evidence that you laid out in all the ancient evidence, the three things, you put that all together, it's more than just crafts and rumors about that and chatter online. So
Mhm.
it really makes you stop and think. Let me ask you some quick hitters, not to
Sure.
say
Yeah.
don't not to say be concise, but let me ask you some quick hitters to land the plane here. So what do you think Disclosure Day is all about, the Spielberg movie?
Mm. Yeah. I get the sense that from what I've seen in the trailer, I think it may be going down the route of the premise that intelligences are hacking the brain. And again, I know that's something we talked about a little bit earlier, but I get the
Hmm.
sense from where we see these people whose eyes change. We see that in a couple of the trailers that they
Hmm.
seem to be interfacing with something, and that when this occurs, there's a change in their in their pupils and stuff. So I think it's going down the road of human looking, or human beings that are containing an alien consciousness. Now, I don't know whether he's going to go down the idea of, these are hybrids, or, or whether they are actually, aliens that look like humans. But I get the feeling that it's going to be probably closer to the idea that these are humans that aliens are inhabiting. And um, there's I'm trying to be concise, but I want to sort of highlight someone
Don't
else's research
rush.
as
Don't
kind of relevant
rush.
to this, because I
Yeah,
kind
go
of
ahead.
feel it may be influenced by um, the work that's recently been kind of published in a book called Death by Astonishment. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but there's
Hmm.
basically it's books to do with the recent DMT experiments that involved intravenous DMT, right? So people were they were given DMT through a drip, which meant that they could stay in these DMT experiences for essentially as long as you want. But I think they
Hmm.
stayed for, I don't know if it was like an hour or, but certainly much longer than people who smoke DMT, who have
Yeah,
very
you get a
short
5 minute
experiences.
high. Not that I know.
Right. Right. And so these people were having contacts. They seemed to be interacting with aliens when they're in these experiences. They were having long form dialogues with entities that seem to
Mm.
exist in whatever this DMT space is. Okay. Now, one of the premises that that book makes is that some of these experiences are so alien that the individuals who are having them, are kind of clarifying that there's nothing from their lives, nothing from human media, nothing they've ever seen that would allow their brains to build these pictures. That the things that they're encountering, the worlds
Mm.
they're seeing, are so alien that that information for their brain has to be coming from somewhere else. So the book kind of makes the argument that it seems that there are intelligences that can hack the brain's world building architecture, which we use all the time to to model a world out there that we know isn't accurate, but that we're modeling sensory information in our environment. We see this picture, I see this computer and my walls and stuff, but we know that that's not accurate. We know there's all kinds of frequencies, and we see, like, what's it, 0.01% of the
Hmm.
frequencies that are around us.
Hmm.
So we know that we don't see things accurately. So what he kind of argues is that it may be, or it seems to be, that some of these intelligences that are being encountered are able to change the brain function while we're in these states, and give us a feed of visual information, auditory information that is genuinely alien. It's not from inside us; it's coming from externally, or it's coming up through us, through them modifying our brain function. I know we touched on this earlier, and what I was saying to you about what I think is happening in some of these UFO cases and these encounters is, I think it's the same thing. That what we're seeing in the DMT space, what we're seeing in UFO close encounters, what we're seeing in shamanic experiences, visions, dreams, some of this stuff is overlapping. People are seeing the same beings, the same alien worlds, this really crazy stuff, and it doesn't seem to come from human generated media content, because some of it is so out there that, like I say, they've never seen anything like it in their lives. Um, I think that perhaps that this one getting to there is, I think that perhaps that work has influenced Spielberg, and that we may be given some variant of that. And when we see the machinery on these people and stuff, I think he may be leaning on this idea that experiments that involve entering other realms, and that these beings essentially inhabiting, possessing the people and taking them over. It looks to me like he might be going in that direction. That it's about non-physical humans taking over physical humans in some way. Maybe I'm
Do you
wrong,
think?
but
Do
it's
you
hinted
think?
at.
Do you think he's part of some genuine disclosure movement, and that this is anything more than a fiction film?
No, I don't think so. But I think that, like, a lot of the big movie companies, they do put people out into forums and into the community. They do try and get a sense of what does their target audience, already believe. What are the
Mm.
most interesting theories floating around.
Right.
So I think it's going to be a bit like a mirroring, where it'll be easy to think, look, he's running some kind of disclosure because he's saying exactly the kind of things that we would expect someone to say in a
Hmm.
disclosure, but
Hmm.
because he's listening to those same people who talk about disclosure, and he's creating a universe that matches what they would kind of imagine a possible explosion would look like, right? So I think it's going to be,
Mm.
yeah, very tempting, and it'd be very easy to slide into thinking he's actually in the know, whereas I
Hmm.
think in reality he just has lots of people that are milking the community, and seeing what they're all talking about and taking the most interesting ideas, including, like I said, I think probably some of these ideas from the DMT research in the last few years. I think
Hmm.
he's realized
Hmm.
that you can put together a more interesting alien story than just beings landing in spaceships. if you include some of these ideas about, you know,
Mm,
can they control us? Can they
mhm.
manipulate us? And you see that in the trailer as well, where the woman starts speaking in the alien language. I
Yeah,
definitely think that the slant is towards aliens manipulating humans.
sure, sure. So, do you think are you worried about humanity in the near term? You know,
Yeah,
just
definitely. I mean,
cataclysm. Yeah, why?
um, well, yes. I mean, I think we have a number of black swan events, circling us. AI, obviously, potentially is could be a devastating nightmare for us. Uh, an AI that is either sentient or just absorbs things like protocols like self-preservation and knowing
Hmm.
what's best for us. I mean, even that alone can be dangerous enough. You don't really
Hmm.
need it to be sentient. If an AI scans, and all the information available and comes to the conclusion that to persist is better than not to persist, because
Hmm.
humans all believe that, right? And it takes ideas from us, then it would very quickly find that we have the idea that to persist and continue is more important than to be destroyed,
And combine
and it
that
might
with
say, well,
infinite capabilities.
right.
You know.
And network systems being hacked. Again, one of the worries that I've seen from leaders in the field, particularly like Susan Schneider, who's kind of a leading thinker and philosopher in the AI kind of field, is that it's
Mm,
not so much that we have one system of AI that takes over, but the fact that we have all these different systems, that if they begin interacting and
mhm,
become kind of networked, that there's a
mhm,
bigger danger from that than some singular AI that wakes up. It's the way that these
mhm,
systems are networking. We've already seen there's
right.
complex communication happening between AI
Yeah.
systems that we don't necessarily understand sometimes or what they're doing. That if it gets to a point where we get locked out and that they, are concluding from their calculations what's best to do, that doesn't even need sentience to become really
Mhm.
dangerous. It just, we're no
It's
longer in
just like a
control of this
I
society.
not that I read it, but you've probably read all the Asimov. I'm a fan of science fiction, but I have like not read
Mhm.
any of the classics. But doesn't he have, or actually, is it not? I think it's not Asimov. Someone else maybe has a short story called "The Cold Calculation," and I heard about it once,
Right.
and I loved it, and so I sometimes reference it like at a cocktail party
Hmm.
type of thing. Have you heard of this one where a
No.
stowaway a
Mhm.
stowaway gets on a spacecraft and she puts the weight limit over by 5 pounds a pound, right? And
Mm.
whether it was the AI controlling the ship or the pilot or whatever, the cold calculation is made. This ship is carrying cargo to a civilization. You're gone, you're cut out, and see ya, and you get just blasted into space. So this calculation with the AI, not, sentience not required, to say, hey, who's going to have this energy, the humans or me?
Mhm. Mhm. That
Yeah.
can be very dangerous. So I think, we cannot be sure that's going to work out well. I mean, that's certainly on the horizon, near horizon. But obviously, you always have the nuclear issue. Obviously,
Mhm.
wars that could go nuclear. But yeah, I think it's more in terms of like genetic research as well. Look, we're at the point where obviously people are looking. Well, we are modifying ourselves using
Designer
genetic
babies,
tools.
yep.
Right, and that's gonna accelerate. I mean, there's no way it
Mhm,
won't. Um,
mhm,
I'm not saying that's implicitly bad because we can fix all sorts of genetic diseases. Like I am a
mhm,
proponent for using genetic engineering to fix genetic, disorders and
yeah,
give children, hope who wouldn't have hope. Don't get
yeah,
me wrong. And I think, to be honest, looking at the topic that I do, I think there's errors in the genome that came
mhm,
about from this modification. So I actually think that we
interesting,
do need to fix some of these. But
interesting,
what we can see is there's a risk, of course, is nefarious or just crazy kind of Nazi scientist type people who want
yeah,
to run all sorts of experiments. And that if you get something that's like kind of fixed in the genome and these people reproduce and they're carrying it,
mm,
this can start spreading. You can have like really crazy stuff start spreading amongst the population that can lead to an extinction event, or to us
mm,
becoming like not really human, something else,
mm,
which may not be good. So yeah, that is definitely another potential
jeez,
black swan. Nanotech is another one. Nanotech could do the whole grey goo scenario. We could destroy our world with nanotech. If someone
what's the
decides to make nanotech
gray goo?
weapons.
What's the gray goo
Yeah.
scenario?
So the idea that the nanotech is told to essentially use the surrounding matter to convert it in a particular way, and so you could have your nanobots just churning everything into just grey goo, and they just
Mm,
that's all they do, programmed to do. It's a bit like the idea of
mm,
the AI paperclip argument, that the idea if you have an AI that is told that what it needs to do is just create as many paper clips as it can, and it starts changing everything into paper clips, and that you
Mm.
lose control, and it converts your whole planet and your species into paper clips. So it's a similar idea with
That's that
nanotech.
that why did I get so scared of that? That's a terrifying there's something terrifying about that, right?
There is, yeah. They're both of these have this problem, the nanotech and the AI. That if you end up inputting the wrong instructions or something goes
Mm.
wrong and you're locked out, that it can essentially, yeah, just destroy your entire a very cold again, yeah, that cold
Yes,
calculated thing. It's
yes,
just
yes.
destruction through a cold calculated kind of machinery. Both of those have that kind of potential. So, and
Mm.
nanotech again is a burgeoning industry from medical and all the other things. So, um, yes, we have a number of things that
Mm.
I think that we stand on a precipice where if human consciousness, and let's say human consciousness, human behavior, aims, regulations, if we can't meet these challenges, then it's very likely that medium term we would head towards some kind of either a large die off, a collapse, or extinction event. And I think that is kind of medium term, not remote. We're talking probably by the end of this century, we'd have a good idea whether humanity is on track to, some golden age, or is on the precipice of falling into extinction. I think we will know that before this century is out for sure, maybe much earlier. So yeah, I'm very concerned about that. I think that the non-human intelligence issue and what's going, whether we've got other beings here, certainly is a big question mark. Is important, and it could be a black swan. It could be a risk, but let's be honest. If this whatever's been happening to people has been happening for decades or centuries, it's probably not as pressing as a worry as these other things that are novel that we're doing now that we were not doing. Right. So I'm more concerned about human intent, behavior, the control system. Our world controllers. I call the predatory parasitic world controllers, that the people that were kind of seeing exposed through the Epstein stuff, the powerful figures with nefarious intentions who have their fingers on the control of a lot of the systems we just discussed, make for a much more frightening scenario, perhaps than the aliens. I will caveat that with one thing quickly, though, to say that the bit that does deeply concern me is if there are non-human intelligences that are able to hack the human brain and that potentially inhabit subquantum or quantum realms and are
Mm.
basically able to come up within the quantum processes of the brain and
Mm.
modify how our brains function,
Mm.
taking control of some of our behavior. And that's why I think in some cases happening. That,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, that's like something out of like a horror sci-fi, is that, that at least some percentage of humans are vulnerable to that, and that at any moment they can have influences from a mysterious alien intelligence directing their behavior. That's deeply concerning. And I do want that to be rigorously scientifically explored
Would
and
that be
potentially
demonic?
find. So,
Bringing it full circle, would that be a demonic?
right, because that starts to sound like the kind of thing that people would talk about in demonic possession. Is that you have mysterious non-physical intelligences that can take over people, and as you look back at our ancestors, and not just from the Christian perspective, but cultures all around the world, shamanic cultures, and the Hindu culture, they all
Mhm.
have some kind of version of
Mhm.
spirit beings that can inhabit humans and change their
Mhm.
behavior. So this is not
Mhm.
like a fringe or novel idea. It's something that humans seem to have been talking about for as long as we've got any kind of records, right?
And
But
is it
now we're starting to
necessarily
understand,
bad?
not necessarily bad. Sometimes these are not bad things happening. Like people say inspired, we have the idea of the muses, right? In Greek muses, that potentially we've always had some kind of complex relationship with what we call spiritual beings that are not
Mhm.
physical intelligences. And that in some cases they seem to help humanity and they influence people to do good things and to do, have amazing experiences or whatever. But in other
Mhm.
cases, they seem to influence people to do very dark things and become very unstable and dangerous people. So
Mhm.
that does take us back to the idea of, the conventional model of angels and demons. And
Mhm.
so I think we may be seeing the underlying science now
Mhm.
to explain, what is a angelic alien and a demonic alien? What is it that we're talking about here? And that we may actually be on the cusp and be able to like kind of point our finger at it and say, well, that's kind of what we mean when we talk about a demonic possession or
Mhm.
angelic inspiration. That this is something happening, a real thing that is to do with intelligences that are inhabiting not outer space, but that inner space of the quantum world, that they've managed to download
Hmm.
themselves into the quantum realms, and that
Hmm.
their civilizations can pop up. They can pop. I've kind of jokingly somewhat cosmic moles, that these things may be able to
Mm.
tunnel through
Mm.
that substrate of reality and kind of pop up. And it's a bit interesting because I don't want to sideline too much, but if you look at ancient law and you look at ancient cultures, there's far more reference to gateways, portals, and tunnels and stuff than there is to spaceships. And then when
Mm.
they talk about these gods and visitors and stuff, what we often see is depictions of gates and doors and stuff. So
Mm.
it seems that if those are genuinely inspired artworks and stories, that whatever these intelligences are, that they much more often turn up by just kind of appearing or
Mhm.
tunneling through reality in some way than by flying from the sky. And that fits with a lot of other things that we get. Why don't we see more spaceships? Why don't satellites pick them up all the time? Why is it, Elon Musk and stuff keeps saying, he's never seen them with his satellite. But
Right.
if their primary way of arriving is tunneling through, the substrate of reality, well, then we wouldn't really see them
You
flying
don't need to
around
go
in
through the air, you don't need to go through space, you don't need to pass by a satellite.
no. And you could manifest, ships through that. I mean, maybe they do have them, but they don't necessarily fly from space. That if they can move matter in some way we don't understand and simply manifest here, a bit like we touched on your experience, if they can control, orbs and plasmas and matter in ways we don't quite understand, that maybe they can just manifest. They come through as initially as maybe as that blob of light or
Mm.
plasma or something, and that then they take the forms that they want, that they control um, even matter in a way that we don't understand, or potentially our perceptions. Either of those are potentially very scary, and like I wouldn't blame
Oh,
someone for being kind of scared of it.
extraordinarily. Oh, totally
Right.
destabilizing, ontologically shocking. So my body, so I'm not safe in my body. At any time, someone can explode and
Right.
manifest in my
Yeah.
body. So don't even get me started.
Quite.
So one of my final questions here, if not my final one, is so this control system, Jacques Vallée. If we're talking about this whole attempt to understand what may be true about the beings and history and all of this evolution and life,
Mhm.
um, is it then fair to say when you say you're less worried, but you're more interested about the human risks and what we're doing and all of that and the effects on us, um, is it then fair to say that the control system is not necessarily bad, because people say it's a evil control system, a
Mhm.
bad control system. Is it just the way it is, kind of a thing?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that we can't infer that it's bad. I think that it's much more likely that it's an effect of having had a very deep early involvement with other intelligences. That it's almost that once they get involved, even if they're good, that once they're involved, they kind of have a sense of responsibility. If you are good, particularly, you'd have a sense of some level of
Mm.
responsibility because you think, if you helped engineer a species, like assuming you're not just sort of just fly off and leave it, which seems unlikely if you're that bothered to even do it in the first place, that there's some kind of follow up, and so
Mm.
that follow up is probably that control system. That there is something that then you say, well, we're going to need to have some kind of guiding role, having taken already the step of involving ourselves in this species evolution. Surely now we've got enough interest to have done that. We've got enough interest to shepherd in some way this
Parents,
species.
parents.
Right. You end up in a parental role, a kind of adoptive parental
Who
role,
doesn't
whether
hate their
you want it
parents
or
at
not.
times?
And I think that's what it becomes. And on the negative front, if there's a negative aspect to this, and again, if there are other groups that are negative, then yeah, perhaps they are able to have some level of interference as well. And again, this is just my opinion, but I think that if
Mm.
we're talking about cosmic powers that could launch comets at planets and destroy planets,
Mm.
that there's some kind of stalemate. There's some kind of Cold War like stalemate between some of these groups because it's not. There's a point where it's no longer worth going to a full all-out war because what to destroy whole planets, blow up suns, and what is the gain for anyone? Right, the loss is so enormous, the gains are so trivial, really, to do that kind of warfare. That do they reach a kind of point where it's like, okay, well, we're going to have a framework like humans do, and again, if there's a mirror here in us, it would be that you reach a point where you say, okay, we're so powerful that instead we say, you're able to have some degree of influence on the control grid, and so do we. And let's see how the humans work out. Do they end up going with you or with
Mm,
us? And we give
mm,
them some degree of autonomy, but we are
mm,
both manipulating to some degree, and we won't go to an all out war over them. And if they eventually choose to be extremely negative, then perhaps the more positive group will just pull out and say, you know what, they went a different way. We didn't want them to go that way, but we're going to honor this agreement. We don't want a
mm.
war over it. And vice versa, that perhaps if we choose to go particularly towards a compassionate, benevolent society, these negative forces will do the same and honor their side of it and say, well, we're not going to go to war over it. Humans clearly have gone the other way and we'll pull out. I suspect it's something closer to that. And this control grid, this strange, wacky, paranormal, seemingly field control grid,
Contract.
is some kind of balance of these forces.
It's an agreement.
Yeah, there's an agreement. There's a legal framework. There's their own versions of UNs or whatever it is. That there's some legal framework in place, and that multiple species and multiple types of intelligences, probably AIs and non-physical beings and physical beings, that it's probably way more complicated than we can imagine. That you get to a certain level in this universe that it no longer makes sense to have those kinds of conflicts. Which I could imagine. You think about it, like if you could
Yeah.
just destroy suns and stuff, and use fire weapons faster than light speed weapons at stars. I mean, what is the point in a war at that point between two groups? I mean, what would you
Mm,
be left with? Just an empty
mm.
universe? I mean,
That is so fascinating, man. It 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 makes so much damn sense. Who knows if it's true, but
right.
doesn't it make sense as an alternative to the Fermi paradox? Where are the aliens? What if it's no the flip side of that, the all the way at the other end is where are the aliens? They've been here since the beginning and they're so
Hmm.
powerful. They're so powerful that they have basically opted to be invisible. And it kind of
Hmm.
also explains the invisibility because that was one of the questions. Okay, where are they, man? Why? Why are they doing this to us and leaving us to question and only appearing to mom and pop here and there and so forth?
Absolutely. I think that it's that thing of asking the fish, "Where's the water?" Isn't it? That they don't
Yes,
notice it because it's
exactly,
everywhere.
exactly.
It's the thing they swim in. That if you're
Right.
in a control grid that's been here for a billion years or whatever, that you're not going to know it as anything but part of reality. I mean, there's going to be bits of it that some people don't see, some bits that some people do see. Again, which is why we end up with metaphysical systems and religious systems, because some people do get a sense of it, or maybe some beings come in
Mm.
and have interactions and teach us things. but
Oof.
but generally speaking, that control grid, as you say, is just part of life.
It's the
It's
water.
it's
It's the
yeah,
water.
it's the
Yeah.
water we're swimming in. So where are the aliens? Well, they're fundamentally part of your reality. And
Right.
on that, I just say there's a guy at NASA. It's gone out of my head for a minute, but anyway, he actually proposed that a significantly advanced alien intelligence might become inseparable from the laws of physics itself. That they might
Mm.
become so interwoven into the background of the universe as to be essentially the laws of physics that we're detecting. I mean, so
Wow.
there's ideas that where yeah, and our solar system could have been built. There's all these things like why is the moon perfectly aligned with the sun? That there's some things
Yes.
could be on such a large scale that we don't see them. We say, where's the aliens? Well, they built your solar system. They're
Yeah.
in the fabric of reality. They're in your laws of physics. They created your genome. It's like, but you don't see any of that because you're looking for a spaceship. But it's on such a grand scale that
Mm.
you're not noticing that the aliens are built into everything.
Yeah. That is gorgeous and interesting. Yeah. So why is the moon? Final question. Why is the moon so proportionally perfect?
Yeah, I do get the sense that potentially our solar system has been from the beginning some kind of experiment, and that these things have been ordered in a way that looks very strange. The alignments of
Hmm.
our moon,
Hmm.
so that it gives these perfect eclipses, and the fact that I'm not saying it was always like that, but it aligns with when we get this sentience. That we happen to live in that time when it's like that, and that
Hmm.
we see there's other mysteries about planets in our solar system. What happened to not only to Mars and Venus that should have had life, but what's happened there. There's also Ceres. I don't know if you know the dwarf planet Ceres, which in a study a few years back, they an AI was run over images of Ceres, and basically it detected what appears to be a geometrical pattern inside the largest crater on the dwarf planet. of what looks like a triangle inside a square, inside a circle. And human volunteers who also looked at these images saw geometry as well. And so, I get the feeling that maybe Ceres is the moon of a destroyed planet that was there, that there may be another
Mm,
inhabitable planet, and that what we see on Ceres is just a signpost saying, like, we were here, but
mm,
again, we ignore it. And the guy who ran the study was sort of like, the problem is maybe AI will reveal things that we humans aren't ready to see. So it's saying, well, look, there seems to be geometry encoded into this thing. And we're like, well, the AI is malfunctioning, or, it can't be because aliens aren't real. And we
mm,
may be getting data all the time that is kind of at the fringes of this control grid and this presence. But the human consciousness hasn't got to the point where it can accept that evidence. And, that same argument can be put to some of the UFO phenomena, and, which again, although I don't say they are evidence of aliens landing, it doesn't mean that what we're seeing with all the experience isn't to do with that alien control grid, right? That the fact that people have these experiences may be built into how humans function, technologies that are being used on us that cause us to see things. All of those
mm,
things can be part of that same control grid. Maybe there's so many of these
mm.
large, higher level things happening, but they either get ignored or not seen, and that we're just not quite ready. And that at some point we will see, like our eyes will be opened, and we'll be like, oh, obviously the moon was put there. Oh,
As
obviously
you
our genome was,
right, right.
you
As you say, we're still in the philosophical stage
know.
of the so you people like yourself and in some very small way, maybe people like me hosting people like you and being curious, we're
Hmm.
thinking we're opening that aperture and we're shining that light and we're saying let's keep going here because we're definitely not at the apex of knowledge. So,
Yeah.
okay, this has been an extraordinary conversation, really about, I mean, isn't it so clear why someone who hosts a podcast about politics and identity and culture and individualism and identity really
Hmm.
is so relevant? It's so relevant. The alien question, the ancient mystery question. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
thank you so much. It's really
No
been a
worries.
treat. Final question: yes
Sure.
or no? Are there alien civilizations? Are there structures on the dark side of the moon?
Um, I'm probably gonna go for. I think I'd go for no. Although I'm open-minded because we do hear these stories from people saying that they were taken up
Right.
and saw it. But um, I'm gonna go for no. I'm not convinced at the moment, but yeah, I'm open-minded.
What do you think about? Okay, I'm such a liar. Very last question. What do you think about Congressman Tim Burchett's constant going-ons about the underwater bases?
Mm. Underwater bases, I'm probably more leaning towards that there could be a presence there, because I think that if you're going to have kind of monitoring stations, um, putting them
Part of
in
the
the deep
control system. Yeah.
oceans, it,
Hmm.
it does make sense. Yeah, and I will say this actually, in that original material from Valerie in the book, again, I didn't really say that she had a book called Outringa When the First Ancestors Were Created, so people can
Mm.
read that. But in there, she actually does mention that when this craft arrived, some of them, before it's destroyed, some of them go down, create underground facilities or under ocean facilities or something like that, and where they transfer some of the equipment to. And it's never really resolved in the information she gets as to what happened to those, whether they still exist, because they're kind of mentioned in one part and not mentioned again. But so,
Mm.
yeah, I'm quite open to the idea that they did create some kind of facilities, and that it's a logical place to just keep a small presence that monitors us.
I don't know that I would go with everything Jordan Maxwell ever said. I'm not a,
Yeah.
I haven't studied his work, but I've seen several lectures and watched a bunch of medium-sized clips. So I know kind of Jordan Maxwell's vibe, and he's,
Mhm.
he had an interesting way of speaking, right? And one of the things he would say is,
Mhm.
the world is far older and stranger than you think, right? And so
Mhm. Mhm.
perhaps it is, and just it's fascinating to think about that and what could be,
Keep an open
you know,
mind.
behind the behind that door, behind the corner, under the sea. What could it be? Keep an open
Mhm.
mind. Keep remain interested in humanity, not just for the pie in the sky, but for how it connects to real life and kind of right. I'm sure you would agree that that's kind of where I am
Mhm.
with it now. It's like because I used to think, oh, how like a year, 2 years ago, 3 years, 2, 3, 4 years ago, I would be like, hey, I'd love to meet an alien. Bring me up, beam me up. That'd be cool. Now, married, life is stable. My life is good. Zero interest. Actually, don't want.
Yeah.
I say, don't. I
No.
don't want to be bothered. So it's not that I'm not interested. I'm super interested, but I don't want to destroy my own life. You got to live
Mhm.
your life on earth too, right? On the ground. So the
Absolutely,
balance
and
to,
on that, I was just going to say, I mean, there are people who've done, they get involved with those kind of CE5. You go out and ask
yeah,
for intelligence to speak to you, and there are stories where that goes horribly wrong, and that people end up with lives plagued with what we'd call, paranormal or psychical events, and driven
right.
bonkers by it. And someone asked me, did I want to, you know, do that sort of stuff? I said no, because I mean, I've had sort of paranormal and psychical problems in parts of my life, and
Hmm.
so whereas I understand you could have a wonderful experience, I think when you invite in the unknown, that unknown comes with a big U. You really don't know what it is, so like, yeah, it can end up being very nice for people, but there's lots of stories of really horrible experiences. So I would tend to err on the side of caution, like you, that unless you're really that super venturous person who's willing to take take the
Hmm.
gamble that it goes the other way and is totally crazy. Otherwise, if you feel like you want a lower risk life, maybe just investigate it a bit from the back and not from the front, and look what other
Amen.
people.
Amen.
You
I mean, I'm so risk averse in all other areas. You think I'm gonna, raise my hand to be abducted? No, no, thank you.
yeah,
Let
yeah,
someone
and
else
I
do
think
that. I don't need the Pulitzer Prize on the story.
mhm.
I'll sit in the back happily.
I'm more interested in us learning how to defend ourselves from those kind of incursions, and
Right.
how to prevent brain hacking, both by human technologies or alien technologies. That I'm far more keen to see that happen, and the new ways to open up to it. Like, I think we need to know how to regulate control of our minds, and we've seen, even through propaganda and influences, that how they can destroy people. Things that go right into your brain. Yeah, no thanks. I
Well, you
think
know
I
what?
prefer.
I won't lie to you. Um, I I include in my prayers a request for, and by the way,
Mhm,
I feel
mhm,
kind of awkward talking about my prayers, but since I said it, I for the longest time really never requested anything in prayer. I thought it was like, who am I to request? I just thank you
mhm,
for this, thank you for
mhm.
this.
Yeah.
But lately, I've been throwing in some requests as well, some humble requests, and one of them is for mental sovereignty. Just in
Mhm,
case, just in
mhm,
case,
mhm,
I say
mhm,
I want to remain in control of my mind. And so,
mhm,
look,
mhm.
man, I know I could get carried away with it, and so I'm glad that so far I've got at least one foot on the ground and trying to keep it that way. But intensely interested in these questions about reality and life and who
Mhm.
we are, and it's just endlessly interesting. I could talk to you forever, and I hope
Right.
to do it again.
Yeah, sure. It's very enjoyable, and appreciate you nudging me into some interesting areas of thought there that we've tackled a lot, and some of the stranger stuff that people maybe don't
Yeah,
think much about their day to day
absolutely.
lives.
Absolutely. This has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time.
Cool. Speak to you again soon.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Likewise. Bye bye.